Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs. I'm also really delighted to help support the programming for the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab here at the school. Today, along with our partners at the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, the NYU Office of Sustainability, and the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, are very excited to bring to you today's conversation. Today's discussion will serve as the first of two virtual food panels. Today will be on the food system and people, and tomorrow on the food system and the planet. We hope you can join us. But without further ado, because we've got some great speakers lined up for you, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Michael Shank. Michael is an adjunct assistant professor here at the Center for Global Affairs, where he teaches courses on sustainable development. And he also serves as the director of engagement for the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Michael and the panel.
We're excited to be in conversation with all of you, and we've got an incredible panel today. I'm not going to spend a lot of time setting the stage because that's what the experts are here for. I will just say that I'm so thankful that food is finally in focus. Now, for those of you who've been working on food for your entire life, it's always been in focus, but for cities and universities to really prioritize food and sustainable food systems is a game changer. And the more we can come together to swap notes, share lessons learned, the better. And New York City and NYU have taken some real leadership roles in the food space, and we're excited to talk about them this week and in September. So what we'll do is spend time with the panelists. First, Tiana, then Neeti, then Gia, and I'll introduce them in a second. And we might be joined as well. Oh, it looks like we are joined by Council Member Sandy Nurse too, to outline the answers to three questions. So the three questions we pose to the panelists are these, and they'll each tick through them at their pace. What's the problem they're working on in the food space specifically? What's getting in the way of their work, our work in solving this problem? So what are the obstacles? And then who or what do you need to solve it? And that question especially will tee us up nicely for September in person when we talk solutions. So the order of conversation today, Tiana Rainford, the project director from East New York Farms, will present first, followed by Neeti Jain. She's the strategic partnerships advisor at New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, followed by Professor Gia Merlo, clinical professor, nursing and psychiatry, also a senior advisor on wellness at the NYU Rory Meyers College of Nursing. And then lastly, Sandy Nurse, New York City council member representing District 37. So they will all answer those three questions. And as they're talking, if anyone in the audience is thinking through a question, please put it in chat. I will be monitoring chat. I won't interrupt their presentations, but we want to jump in very quickly to a Q&A with the panelists. So if a question comes to mind, please put it in chat. Certainly panelists can answer in chat if they'd like, and I will lift up those questions during the Q&A. So with that, let's jump in, and Tiana graciously agreed to go first. So Tiana, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Should I also introduce a little bit about myself?
If you'd like, sure, please.
Yeah, so I graduated from Brooklyn College in 2019 with a bachelor's in science and food and nutrition studies. And since 2019, I've been working with East New York Farms, which is an urban agricultural project based in East New York, Brooklyn. East New York is on the far east of Brooklyn. It's a little south, really fairly close to Queens, and is categorized as a food desert and a food swamp. Part of the community is a food desert where there's a limited access to healthy food, and a part of the community is considered a food swamp where there is access to food, but it's all fast food. So East New York Farms does a lot of work to bridge that gap between access to healthy foods throughout the community. East New York also has the highest concentration of community gardens in all of the city. So just a little bit about the org and myself really quickly. As far as what the problem is, the current problem that we're facing in the agricultural space when it comes to food and people and access to food has been funding for green jobs, access to local, fresh, affordable foods. As we all know, if you've been to the supermarket recently, everything is more expensive. And it's for a multiplex of different things. And I think that a huge problem is that we're not capitalizing on what we can source locally, as well as gradual defunding of nutrition incentive programs such as SNAP. What is getting in the way of us solving this problem? I truly believe it has to do with capacity building. A lot of the work is being done by nonprofits that can only do so much. And pay inequalities for green jobs. Green jobs are unrecognized essential workers. And we all learned that during the COVID and the pandemic, when everybody was down for the count. People who were doing food distributions or growing food became some of those unrecognized essential workers, and were truly needed during that time, but they're not being paid in the same ways. And I believe to solve it, funding, policy change, of course, is a huge one, and collective support of community and other organizations to green jobs and organizations that are doing these kinds of work. I hope I wasn't too quick, but I'm gonna pass it.
That was great. Thanks, Tiana. Yes, there's so much to explore in the capacity building space, the funding space. Yeah. And just to encourage folks, I will be putting links in chat. So I just put a link to Tiana's work at the East New York Farms in chat, and I'll be doing that for all the speakers too. And speakers, if you have links that you want folks to read, check out, please put them in chat as well. Thank you, Tiana.
Yeah.
Did you have something additional?
I would just say something that's ongoing is the Farm Bill, support for the Farm Bill, and also compost, refunding of compost programming. So if you're looking to do something collective action, those are two places that I would direct you to.
Thanks, Tiana. So yeah, again, to folks just joining, today's focus is on people, food systems impact on people. So topics that might come up in conversation around food security, food justice, food sovereignty, food deserts. We'll also talk about food's impact on individual health, individual and community health. So again, today's focus really on people, tomorrow's panel really on planet. Obviously, there'll be some crossover, there's some overlap given panelists availability. But what themes you'll hear come up today intended to be focused on people and the food system's impact on people. So some of the themes that you'll hear are related to that. Thanks, Tiana. Let's jump over to you, Neeti.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Tiana. That was really great to learn a little bit more about East New York Farms. So my name is Neeti Jain. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Advisor for the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy. And our office really serves as an agency that helps advise other city agencies on food distribution, procurement, and access. And the work that I do is specifically at the intersection of food and climate and community. So excited to be here talking with you all about this issue. I'll maybe start by giving like a quick summary of how food systems affect people. And I think the two ways in which I've really been thinking about this issue is the impact on folks' individual health and health outcomes in New York City, as well as the impact of our agricultural systems and industrial production on the health of communities that surround those sites. So I'll start with the first one, with the problem of our food system now and how it impacts individual health. The mayor's office has really been focused on the intersection of health and food and community because of the mayor's own health journey. Mayor Eric Adams was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and, is fighting a chronic disease that disproportionately impacts Black Americans across the country. Black adults are 60% more likely to be diagnosed with chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes. And for the mayor, changing a lot of his lifestyle decisions, including his diet, was a big part of him being able to fight type 2 diabetes and reverse some of the symptoms associated with that disease. And so focusing on fighting chronic disease through food has become a real priority and legacy of this administration. And we're starting to see like an influx of understanding that food can be a source of medicine. But really knowing that on the flip side, food can also be contributing to some of our chronic disease problems, particularly for vulnerable communities in New York City. And then turning to the impact of our food system on communities and the health of communities, I really want to point to the fact that we as a country have an over reliance on certain forms of agriculture, particularly animal agriculture, at sites like concentrated animal feeding operations, what a lot of folks refer to as factory farms, which also hurts the health of communities that are both surrounding those sites and global. So, and I'd love to get deeper into this as we continue the conversation, but as a result of industrial production at concentrated animal feeding operations, we see pollution of air and waterways surrounding those sites that go on to directly impact the communities that live around those areas, which tend to be predominantly Black and Brown communities or low income communities in the United States. Um, Looking a little bit more globally, a lot of our animal agriculture incentivizes deforestation in places like the Amazon and creates perverse incentives for communities to have conflict over land, to dispossess land from indigenous groups, and participate in systems of illegal ranching or cattle laundering, which is a term that I learned recently, in order to be able to provide the animal proteins that we consume in the global north. And then finally, a depletion of fresh and groundwater in countries that are already most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, that are going to see higher rates of drought and changes to what they're able to grow and produce for the global food system. So all of these things in conjunction suggest that we really have to think about transforming our food system to move away from our reliance on forms of agriculture that can be so harmful. And that's the problem. When I think about what's getting in the way of solving this problem as New York City, as the mayor's office, but also as, a community of practice in the food system, I think first and foremost, food is not often seen as a climate solution or even an environmental justice solution. Certainly access to food very much is, but how we're producing our food and what impact that has on our communities is not often seen as a climate solution or an environmental justice issue. So understanding that changing our food consumption habits and our reliance on animal agriculture, understanding that to be an important toolkit in our climate conversation is, I think, first and foremost, an issue and by extension, a solution that we need to think about. I think there's also resistance from our industries to shift demand away from the kinds of, cheap and efficient ways of producing animal proteins that we have right now. There's a reason that we have things like factory farms, and it's because it's incredibly profitable and it's because it's incredibly easy and efficient. But that also leads to kind of another issue, and what is getting in the way of solving this problem, which is that our farmers and our growers and producers don't often feel like they have the political or economic independence and capacity to kind of fight for their ability to make decisions around how they're growing and producing, or to kind of resist some of the big agriculture companies that really make a lot of decisions around how operations are run, how communities are being affected by these things, and how legislation is protecting communities. So to finally get to what we need to solve it, certainly a big, big question to try to answer in just a couple minutes. But I'll say that certainly we need better legislation to protect our communities. We need to think about ways in which our air and water can be better protected by the environmental regulation we already have now. So better enforcement of those regulations and more legislation that really focuses on the health of vulnerable communities in the United States and surrounding concentrated animal feeding operations. This might be a little bit of a hot take, but I think also, I'll reflect what the World Bank said in a recent report, which is that we should really change the economic incentives. Right now, there are a lot of subsidies for animal products like meat and dairy that don't reflect the true cost of those products and don't internalize some of the environmental impacts that come as a result of that production. And so if we can shift our subsidies away from that kind of production and into sustainable production for alternative proteins, fresh fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, pulses, all of the things that you've always been told to eat more of, then I think we can align some of our economic incentives with our environmental issues. And finally, just seeing a change at the institutional level at universities, in cities, in our private sector, and certainly in our federal and state government on how we understand our food systems and what kinds of production we want to prioritize. So I'll pause there. Thank you for giving me this platform, and excited to dive into these issues with more depth.
Thank you, Neeti. It's gratifying for me to see students past and present on this call, and hopefully they're inspired by the presentation so far, because there's so much work to be done in the food space, so much need for talent. And so thrilled that NYU students are here, because we need your leadership in this space, in the many spaces that have already been identified by Tiana and Neeti. And just to illustrate Neeti's point about how intersectional this is, and how many other departments in a city or departments at a university can and should get involved in food, because it's very cross-cutting. All right, so let's keep going. Dr. Merlo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so blown away by what Tiana and Neeti just said, because they kind of said a lot of things I was going to say. So this is great. So I can move a little further, and maybe we can dive a little bit more and go a little further with what the conversation was already. So I am a psychiatrist. I'm a fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. I'm the chair of a whole new initiative within the American Psychiatric Association, moving forward this whole intersection of what happens in our body and what happens in our brains. And that, I think, is really important. And food is really relevant in this conversation, because we know that even before the pandemic hit, we were struggling with social isolation. Our Surgeon General talked about, the epidemic of social isolation. But in addition to that, with our depression and our state and our mental health, and that just got exponentially worse during the pandemic. So we do have some compelling data around what is happening within our brains as vis-a-vis food and other lifestyle interventions, and what's happening in the planet. So that's really kind of that's my first question, answer the first question. What's the problem? I think that we really need to make these disparate sort of constructs connected in a different sort of way, which I think that Neeti and Tiana really did a great job in starting that conversation. So I think what's getting in the way, and I really want to delve into that, because 5 minutes is, this is like, I could talk for days on this, so I'll get really excited about this. But I think just to try to distill it down to a few points that may be helpful, I think that there's a conversation that we tend to get extremism in when we talk about this, right? We go from, okay, you're not eating healthy food, you're eating ultra processed food, to only eat fresh, whole food, plant-based food. And I think that people tend to get stuck in there because it's a very big ask. And so I'm one of those that says, as a psychiatrist and as someone that's really concerned about psychology and mental health and what's happening in our brain, we need to do it in a stepwise way. So I tend to think of things as what is the first step that we would suggest, because we're not going to get 100% of the planet to stop eating unhealthily or things that affect the planet. We're not going to get there. And we may get there, and my hope is we get there. But let's talk about the first step and the second step and the third step, and depending upon where you are in that space, then we can move forward. So I think that the major things that I would say, the three major things that I would do, is decrease beef consumption, decrease ultra processed food, and increase our fiber. And I would love to answer questions around that, but I have a visual to try to start this conversation. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. So this one, and Neeti was talking about, what's happening in agriculture. Can everyone see this? Is this okay? Yeah. Okay, so what was happening in agriculture? And this slide really kind of depicts that. So if you look at the top band up there about the land use that we have for agriculture across different diets, that's our normal standard American diet. So basically we're saying it's 4.4 billion hectares of agriculture is being used if we eat the way we're eating right now. And if we just cut the beef production and consumption in everyone's diet, and don't cut out the beef that's coming from the dairy that's already going to be slaughtered, but just the beef that's grazed and raised for that, we would decrease almost by half of what we're using in the land. Okay, that's huge. So we're going from almost 4 billion down to 2 billion. Okay, rounding. And then if we also decrease and have no beef, mutton, or dairy, and add dairy in there, then we're halving that again, which is 1 billion hectares of land that we're using. So if we just did that, and then every iterative process from there on is not really changing it much. You see that? So then the fourth is when we take out eggs. Take out poultry, and then the last one is when you have 100% vegan diet that's no eggs and fish. But really the maximum impact, number one would be beef, and then number two is taking that dairy out. And if we did that, 75% of the land that we're using for production and for all of this would actually be made available for feeding the world. Okay, the next slide is really from the Eat Lancet Commission. If anybody has not read this, this is a really good way to really conceptualize and what is going on. And this was a commission that was put together by the Lancet and basically recommended, based on what I just showed you, recommended the maximum animal source foods that you eat per day, saying have up to 2 animal products per day. So this is, again, not the extremism, 100% animal products or 0%, saying have up to 2. And one of those could be a serving of dairy, yogurt, milk, or cheese, and one can be a serving of seafood, poultry, or eggs. Now, if one of those servings is meat, you can only have that one serving per week, red meat, because we know how much red meat affects the planet as well. So I think that is really a good take-home message to try to get people to start understanding what we would aim towards decreasing our reliance on animal-based products. Then the second thing I talked about is ultra-processed foods. So NOVA classification of processed foods, if you see group 1 is a minimally processed, which we're always talking about, eat whole food, plant-based. And then if you go to the other extreme, group 4 is the ultra-processed food. What I want to focus on today is group 3, which is the processed food. So right now, about 60 to 65% of all of our diets in America, and this has only been in the last 40 years, is this ultra-processed food. And what I would suggest is, yes, try to go for those minimally processed, but really that group 3, the processed foods, is something that we can actually focus on in our populations and say, what about those frozen vegetables and fruits that have one single ingredient, don't have a lot of other things in there, but are frozen, you can get for a couple of dollars, and they could feed a family with other things? Why not? How about those? How about talking about canned goods, canned beans, lentils? Those in itself can be processed food, but they're not ultra processed food. And where the data really is the ultra processed food, and is really what's causing a lot of problem. Fiber rich foods, 95% of our diets are, the 95% of the population don't have enough fiber in their diets. This feeds our gut microbiota and feeds what's going on in our gut. And that is necessary for mental and physical health. I'll stop.
That's great. Thanks, Dr. Merlo. To be continued, questions, and encouraging folks to put questions in chat. I'll actually get to Sophia's after Councilmember Nurse's presentation. I think we'll jump in to questions in chat straight away because Sophia's got a good one pivoting off of Tiana's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Merlo. Let's get to Councilmember Nurse, and I'm going to put your site in chat. Over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate being here and being a part of this conversation. I'm not going to kind of go over all of the problems. I think most of you all here are familiar with them. And of course, the 3 panelists illustrated them very eloquently. I'll just kind of put into context some of the stuff we're working on at the city level and within the municipality as a legislator and someone who helps advocate for different things in our giant city budget here in New York City. Some of the problems from my point of view, or the things that I'm trying to tackle, really have to do with access and more availability of fresh food, right? And we have a lot of tools that work here in the city. We have tax credits for people who want to do food retail shops. You get great, almost 25 years tax abatement for doing this work. And those abatements are available in specific areas of New York City that are historically underserved by fresh food retailers. But I think the thing that I've been really trying to figure out is how do we create the infrastructure? Like, we have great infrastructure, like East New York Farms and the legacy of community gardens. Those are great hyper local places for fresh food production and community gathering and education, but the scale of it is not where we need it to be. And all gardens are not created equal in terms of how they're managed and the level of production that they make. And so we're focused on the infrastructure for hyper localized inner city production of food that we can produce here, and we can produce in some kind of way that's competitive and affordable. And so we actually have a bill, or one of the ways we're trying to solve this, we have a bill on food infrastructure where we're, wanting the city to identify industrial spaces, manufacturing spaces where they can provide low-cost rates for organizations or businesses that want to focus on food production and distribution or assembly of different types of products, that they can do that here in the city, and it's affordable, because there's nothing affordable here in New York City. So without the state or the city really stepping in and creating that viability for businesses, we're not going to see this type of industry take off. And so that's some of the stuff we're working on. Legislatively, I think some of the other things we're doing and members are able to do with our discretionary funding as council members is really try to change culture through education, early education. One of the things that two of my school districts are really excited about is the smaller hydroponic farms inside the school classrooms. And while those are not necessarily producing a ton of stuff, right, because they have to fit in the classrooms, they are compatible with the school year calendar. It's all year access. Those classrooms smell amazing, like fresh tomatoes and basil. And then, students are able to produce, and they take the stuff home. And so we're trying to scale that up across the district as like small steps towards culture change. And then some of the other things that we're working on that unfortunately at the city level, we can't fully do without, changing some of the way our federal subsidies work, is focusing on ready-to-eat meals for people who have diabetes. Diabetes hugely impacts East New York and Brownsville, and there's a lot of educational programs. You can learn how to cook, you can learn how to shop better. There's a lot that exists out here around food education. However, I think the real challenge is that there's just compounding crises. So people are housing insecure, they're living in small apartments, they're working multiple jobs. I mean, you could teach people how to cook and make wonderful meals, but they don't have the time. And it's more important to get this medicine to them. And so we're really trying to build out thinking about what are ways in which we can produce ready-to-eat meals. There was a program that was operating in Brownsville at the Community Culinary Center where they were producing ready-to-eat meals. They're not frozen, but they come, they're healthy, they're tasty, they're proportionately sized, and we can just get it to people as their actual medicine. Because unfortunately, it's just a huge hurdle for people to eat better and shop right and make time in their lives for food prep and all that, with everything happening here in the city. So it's really about how do we get folks what they need in a way that actually solves the problem and creates the least amount of work for them. And so those are some things that we're working on at the local level. Just to kind of tie in the full cycle of food, we also last year passed the Zero Waste Act, which was a set of 5 bills at the city level. One of them included the curbside organics collection bill that would extend food waste collection by the city for residents to everybody in New York City by the end of this year, actually. So Manhattan and Staten Island and the Bronx are coming online this fall. And while that was an important step, part of the challenge is a lot of this food waste is going to go to energy production, like biomethane, and not as much to actual generating compost, which could be used locally for growing food. And so we also have a bill for composting infrastructure in each borough to have large scale actual processing, education sites, and distribution systems for the food waste in New York City, because that is a valuable material, and that has to be a part of the equation when we're talking about changing the food system. So I'll stop there, and I'm excited to engage in questions with everyone.
Thank you, Councilmember. What an incredible group of minds. We're so lucky to have the 4 of you weighing in with your work in this space. And a reminder to folks who joined, today is really focused on people and the food system's impact on people in all the ways, many of which were already identified. And also just a shout out again to the organizations behind today's conversation, the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, NYU's Office of Sustainability, Center for Global Affairs, Energy, Climate Justice and Sustainability Lab, and then my organization, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. We're thrilled that all of you are here. Now in chat already, questions are coming up for specific people. So I encourage folks to whom those questions are directed, if you're willing to answer in chat so that all folks can benefit. But what I would like to start off with is a question from Sophia, because it has to do with definitions. So earlier at 12:14, Sophia put in, pivoting off of Tiana's mention of policy support and how policies have to change to support urban ag, to all panelists on the policy side, do you think we need a better definition of food security where we integrate pillars such as food access, food availability, food utilization, and food sustainability? She had some parentheticals there too that folks can check out. But I'd be curious if any of the panelists want to get to the language we're using, how you're using the language or not around anything vis-a-vis food justice, food security, food sovereignty, and more. So I'd love, not everyone has to weigh in, but curious, and I will just popcorn it. If anyone wants to, especially the panelists, want to weigh in on the language you're using and what you find to be working.
I can start. Mine is easy. So in my space, I know everyone talks about plant-based, but I'm really moving towards plant-forward as opposed to as a way to construct what we're doing. So we need to think about moving. The words I like to use are crowding out. That if we eat more healthily and we eat more plant-based foods, then we'll have less in our budget of our stomach to eat the unhealthy food. So if you could do that and you crowd out with the healthy food. So I tend to go with plant forward, plant predominant, and not plant-based anymore. So that's an easy one.
Thank you, Gia. That's really helpful. Councilmember Neeti, Tiana. Oh, Tiana, great, please.
I can follow up with that. At our org, we're more concerned with sustainability efforts. Since we have a large network of community gardeners, using our resources that we have within the community to distribute food, to ensure that we're becoming more food secure. So we have like this double entendre where we don't have access to healthy food, but we have so many community gardens. So how can we use the community gardens and the resources we have and this knowledge that we have in the community of people around health and nutrition to better our health?
Excellent. Thanks, Tiana. Any additional comments on that question in particular around language? I'll just add that the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, our sister organization, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which represents 300 cities and counties across North America, has recently stood up a whole network of urban ag directors, so urban agricultural directors. And that was a first for our cities. We're starting to see cities build out these offices more and more and hire directors for urban ag. Similarly, and in parallel fashion, the build out of offices of food policy. Obviously, New York City has a very healthily staffed and focused Office of Food Policy, but increasingly cities are building out offices of food policy. But even across cities, as was alluded to earlier, it's not often in the climate department or climate office or environmental office or department. So you're seeing a build out, but oftentimes in some cities it's segmented or siloed. And so the need for this intersectionality and the de-siloing of this work so that it fits, as we know and has already been identified, across many departments, including health, and in various community services and community programs too, not just food specific, but also environmental, climate, sustainability. So you can see the cross-cutting nature of it. So again, questions that were directed, like Dr. Merlo, there's a question from Nev, one of my students, about ACLM's role in all things political, emphasis, influence, impact. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So for those that don't know these acronyms, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, ACLM, we're going to have our 20th anniversary in November, and it's a relatively new organization, about 15,000 plus members at this point. So what I could say to that is I am actually on the climate change committee of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. So it's a newly incorporated committee. And what we have done is we actually did send a white paper for the Farm Bill when that was being looked at. So we're separating out advocacy versus activism. So we do some advocacy around these issues, and our climate change committee is doing that. And I know there's a bill coming up in New York as well about microplastics and getting rid of that. And I think that we have, I don't know, Michael, you're looking like you don't know what I'm talking about. So,
oh, sorry, no, I was just tracking the chats. That's the
okay.
Apologies,
Yeah,
apologies.
so there's a bill right now in New York State about microplastics and reducing that over the next 75% reduction over the next 2 to 3 years. So that's also something that I know that we're getting very involved in. So yes, ACLM is not as a whole, but we have subcommittees and committees that are actually trying to address those as well.
Thanks, Gia. There's another question that has to do with quantity versus quality. So this goes back to the language we use, because when we use language like food security, which might be language that in the United States, both parties feel very comfortable using, it could lead to measuring production versus the quality of food, which kind of attends to Sophia's question here and how we change this. So mindful of language and what language we use, I'd be curious if panelists want to weigh in on that, because a term like food security might open more doors, but it also might trigger a response that has to do with fast tracking production versus, quality food or food sovereign approaches or food just approaches, et cetera. So does anyone want to address that question?
I mean, I can say a few words because I feel like I'm constantly I'm just interchanging all the time what I'm talking about, and maybe even code switching among different, groups or audiences in some way. But I think that at the end of the day, the goal should be to communicate that, we want people to be healthier, and we want our communities to be healthier, and we want the way in which we achieve that also has to be inclusive of how food is produced, how it's distributed, the workers who are doing that work. I mean, it has to encompass everything. It really is about looking at the whole system, and whatever language makes sense for that audience, to get them pulled into the conversation. I have no problem with people using different terminology if it activates people into the conversation, where as community leaders or people who are spending a lot of time on these issues, we're able to then really expand on what we're talking about and hopefully land the points that need to be landed that pull us back to the actual goal of what I believe we're all here for, which is changing culture, changing the way we're taking care of ourselves, our communities, and everybody involved in the process of making and consuming food. So that, to me, I understand those things matter, but I think most people that I've come into contact with over the last 12, 15 years around the general food movement, whatever entry point you're in, have really had good intentions and are genuinely wanting to focus on change. So I understand it can be upsetting, and hopefully we all take some responsibility in making sure we're really thorough in our conversations.
Thank you, Sandy. So for the entire group's benefit, we stood this up fairly quickly. Again, the groups that I mentioned earlier came together a couple of weeks ago and said, hey, we want to weigh in together. We want to get this conversation up and running. As everyone knows in this room, there are many conversations about food. So the question I have for the panelists, as we continue, hopefully, fingers crossed, as a group, New York City, NYU, Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, other orgs, the orgs represented here, as we continue to drumbeat and think about intersectionality and collaboration and coordination and capacity building, et cetera, when you look at the food conversation, especially as it impacts people, again, Tomorrow's Planet, for those of you who haven't signed up for that, join us tomorrow at noon Eastern for a planet-based conversation in terms of food systems impact on planetary health. Today is really about people health, individual health, community health. Do you wish conversations would be oriented differently? And how, if we do organize something in September, really focused on solutions, how can any of that organizing effort serve your work's interests? And so that anything we're standing up in and around Climate Week, that it really is beneficial, because there are many conversations, thankfully, it's a good thing, on food of late, but we want to use our time wisely and efficiently. So, for the panelists, for the 4 panelists, as you think about, because you're all very busy doing incredible work in this space, if we do organize something based on your analysis of how food is currently discussed, what would really help break through some barriers in a way that moves your work forward and the food work forward in meaningful ways? Do you have any thoughts on that? And I didn't prep panelists with this conversation, so it's out of the blue. But Tiana, it sounds like you might want to weigh in. I see you going off mute. There we go.
Yeah. I think that for me, anything that's attached to a collective action, I do think it's important to have a roundtable discussions and to do education around things. But I think that when you get everyone in the room, it's important to do an action towards a larger movement, whether that be signing petitions, doing testimonies, agreeing to volunteer at a space, or collectively giving monetary contributions. But doing a collective action when you have everybody who's willing to fight for one cause, to not lose that by just having everyone in the space and discussing solutions.
I love
but
it.
Working towards an active solution.
And if I may, Tiana, if you're willing to find, if East New York Farms has an action, I mean, I'm guessing you had this nice list of potential actions. I'm guessing you have one action that we all could take. If you're willing to put that in chat, and of all the presenters, your org is the easiest to donate to, because we've got university and city folks here and council member folks. So I encourage folks to donate. I'm guessing you've got a donate button too, but if you've got a collective action opportunity that we could all contribute to with East New York Farms, please identify it for us in chat. That would be great.
I'll drop some links right.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Other thoughts to the panelists? Yeah, Dr. Merlo.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't want to, if someone else wanted to say something, I wanted to let them go first. But I think also, just to understand that it's not a one size fits all. And I think that actually tends to be a little reductionistic, and it turns off a lot of individual patients from my experience. So maybe even having little buckets of actionable plans, like people that have trauma, people that have social determinants of health, unhoused, and having different buckets of what we can do for that population or that individual would be very helpful, rather than a general sort of idea. Because, as Anita had said earlier, it's like we all know what to do, right? Generally, we know we want people, but I think just really pivoting and really honing in. And for me, it would include, of course, the social determinants of health, include people with trauma, but it also would include people that are not willing to go the whole way and want more easier sort of solutions, more the gray solutions.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Buckets for different communities to engage in the ways you mentioned. Neeti, it looks like you're going off mute. Over to you.
Yeah. I think I'll just add to the conversation that we should have more people at the table. And as someone who's been sort of in the environmental justice space, I feel like we always talk about increasing our stakeholder engagement and increasing our understanding of who needs to be at the table. But to the extent that we can sort of identify that everybody is impacted by the food system, whether that's consumers, whether that's policymakers, whether that's producers and growers, ultimately the kind of end goal is to help all of us live in a world that has better access to food and more sustainable food. So I think eliminating some of our internal fighting over what that sustainable food future looks like, and understanding that we all kind of have to move in this direction. I think I'll just say very, very candidly that I think our office needs to do more of a job in engaging New York City's and New York State's growers and farmers. And I think we have an Office of Urban Agriculture, as Michael was alluding to earlier, but we need to be working in conjunction with communities and with farmer communities in order to make these moves, because we can kind of create all the policy and legislation that we want, but unless it sort of is led by communities, then it's not going to have the greatest impact.
Excellent. Thanks, Neeti. Council member, do you have some thoughts? No? All right. And Tiana's putting some links in chat in terms of how folks can take action locally. Thank you for that, Tiana. Other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got some great questions already in chat. Other questions, if folks want to go off mute and ask them quickly, please do. Or if you want to put them in chat, do so as well. And then to the panelists, if you've got questions for each other or things you didn't say in presentation that you want to add, please use this time too. And a reminder that tomorrow at noon, we will have a focus on planetary health and the food system's impact on the planet. Here's a link for, thank you, Michelle, for doing that.
I'd like to pose a question to Dr. Gia.
Great, please.
Around what are some ways that you see institutions, whether it be orgs or individuals, providing education to change mindset around what kind of foods we choose?
Beautiful. Wow, what a wonderful question. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the $1 million question. I don't know where we are with this, but when I was growing up, it's a $10,000 question. So it's $1 million question or $1 billion question. And I think the question is that we usually start the conversation with motivation, with behavioral motivation, but I think we need to start before then. And that's why I was talking about the buckets, because I feel like most people are inherently motivated to change. If you tell them this is good for you, most people will say, okay, I'll try. But the problem may be something else. And we need to really understand what that is. So I think being receptive and open, and I love stakeholder engagement conversation and listening. So if I were designing it, future panels, I would say we would actually bring those stakeholders into the conversation of the fold. I tend to talk about my own journey as well, which I know Eric Adam does but I also talk about my own, and that adds depth to the conversation in a way that we can engage in a different sort of way, because it's easy to be thinking about policy, thinking about individual health, but it's harder when someone's right there and you really need to answer that question, so that you kind of have to dig deeper within where you're thinking. So I think that mindset is a great way to approach it. We need to look at hurdles. We need to look at real hurdles. And I think probably the most important thing is that we talk about within the literature is finding out people's why you can engage them to try to change. And once they identify their why, then you understand what other barriers may be there to engage in the why, and just listen, and then help them construct a plan that makes more sense. So that's usually how we start this conversation. After you look at the barriers, right? If someone's been traumatized and that makes it difficult, if they have something that's serious mental health issues and you need to work with that, if they can't walk, then you need to figure out, don't tell them about going and exercising. We need to talk about movement. If we're talking about if they don't have more than $2 a day, and if they're in a food desert, we don't talk about getting whole food plant-based foods. We talk about processed foods. We talk about just minimizing the damage. So that's kind of my thought. I hope that helps a little bit, Tiana.
Thanks for that answer, and thanks for that question. And I just want to second some of what you said too, Dr. Merlo, in terms of the power of storytelling. Storytelling is so powerful, and for the mayor to lean into that has been really helpful in terms of educating and messaging on this. And then if we want people to switch or to on-ramp or to try something new, what are the barriers? How do we make it easy for them? Because I can't tell you how many times people in my life, as someone who is plant-based with his diet, people have said, oh yeah, I tried, and inevitably they didn't have options, or it wasn't tasty, or they didn't enjoy it. And so when we do ask or invite folks to think differently or change something in their behavior, making sure it's successful, thankfully we're getting there slowly but surely. But as someone who grew up in Ohio, in Amish Mennonite country, where it was all farming, there weren't a lot of tasty alternatives. So making it a pleasurable experience and a healthy experience for folks is really important too. So when they try, some more take action opportunities coming up in chat. Thanks for that engagement, Councilmember.
I'd love to chime in here too, Michael, if that's okay. I think especially because the mayor's office is working on diet change and shifts and trying to get New Yorkers to demand and consume more sustainable diets. I think this is where the power of the institution is really important. Of course, we want to promote behavioral change at the individual level, but I think one way to make it really easy and allow people to do that in a way that doesn't kind of put all of the responsibility on the individual is to model and provide opportunities in our public schools, in our hospitals, in all of the ways that the city itself is serving food. So we try as much as possible to set climate goals for the city, for how much our city agencies are changing the ways in which we purchase food and serve it to K through 12 students in the public schools, how patients in the public hospitals are interacting with food, particularly as a source of medicine, in addition to something that sustains them while they're in the hospital system. And then also thinking about New Yorkers that are in our correctional facilities, in our shelters, in our older adult centers. Those are all instances in which New Yorkers are interacting with institutional food service. And so if we can use those spaces to model and bring easier access to the kinds of food that we want to see on a larger in a larger setting, then we can at least say that we've taken the first step and we're not putting all of the responsibility only on the individual. Though I think certainly that's the next step is really using that to kind of create behavioral change at the individual level.
Yeah. For folks' benefit, one of the reasons why I started convening a conversation among these different institutions is that New York City and NYU have both gotten on board the Cool Food Pledge and built out areas of focus along those lines. And that's getting us into solutions, which we'll get to in September. But I'm saying all this just because the panelists and the organizers behind this are so engaged in this space. And so if you're not mindful of the full spectrum of how NYU is engaged in food and how the city of New York is engaged in food policy and practice, please get involved, because this is in need of as much smart leadership and energy and momentum as possible, so we can seize this opportunity to really change the food system. We've got a couple minutes left, so I want to defer to panelists for any final questions or comments from the panelists.
I see a question in the
Great. Do you want to tackle it?
Yeah, I can answer a little bit of that.
Please.
I also plant-based, so we got that in common. But as far as like something I hear a lot being plant-based is it's really expensive. And so I second that. It is really expensive. Sometimes eat healthier. What I've found as my personal ways of being able to afford it as much as possible is shopping at places where there is a push for like making the food affordable. So either the farmers market where you can kind of barter, or farmers usually have better pricing and also have fresher foods, or stores like Aldi and Trader Joe's are some ways that I personally try to keep the cost low, because yes, being healthier does sometimes come with the cost. As well as growing your own food and just being sustainable. Sometimes, if you are into gardening, a beautiful thing that happens in the gardening world sometimes is that if I grew a lot of tomatoes and you have a lot of cucumbers, we exchange. So there's that third space being able to tap into. But if anybody else has any insight on that last question too.
Thanks, Tiana. Any of the other panelists want to quickly address this question before we close?
I think I'll just say that. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just
Councilmember,
going to
please.
say, I think that, you know, this is where I believe government is supposed to be really leading. And we should be, you know, the true cost of like an ideal food system is expensive, because when you're taking care of the land and you're taking care of the workers and you're taking care of, and you're improving the supply chains and you're, you know, eliminating emissions, like all of the steps in the process, when you're doing it right, it's expensive, because you're putting value on things that we have not valued before. And so it is expensive. And that is where the city, municipalities, counties, states, the federal government really should be stepping up and saying, like, this is what the cost of a real food system, all throughout the process. This is what it costs, and this is the purchasing power and capacity of most people who live here, and we need to subsidize that in a way that protects both the actual growers and producers, the workers, but also the people consuming it. So I mean, I would love to be able to do what Tiana does. I have zero time for that, and the only way that I'm able to eat better is because I'm in a position where I make more, but I have zero time to really actually engage in my own food process. So the reality is there's just different circumstances for so many different communities. And I really feel like the city and the state and government really should be really focused on I mean, we should all have food stamps, and we should all have SNAP, truly, because I mean, the cost of real food and eating well is just so high, and it shouldn't be something that's just for the well-off. So I'm more of a systems change than an individual change person.
Thanks, Councilmember. Neeti, do you want to have a final comment on it?
I think I was just going to say exactly that. I don't want to keep us past our end, but that this is an instance where like governments need to, and like cities can show leadership in bringing down the cost of food, like using our institutional dollars and procurement dollars to make sure that access to healthy food is something that all citizens can enjoy. And then also, I think, again, trying to internalize the true costs of food so that we're not like, so that we're valuing the things that we purport to value, which is our communities and the health of our lands. And so once we can kind of integrate that and have our system reflect the true cost, then we'll really see like what is more expensive. It might be that in the long run, actually what's more expensive is what we see as cheap food now, but down the line, that's actually going to cost us a lot more in the ways in which we deal with climate change and health outcomes.
Great closing comment. For folks on the call, if you want to help us organize something in September, please reach out to any of us on the organizing side, because we'll need your help in organizing some kind of solutions-focused event in and around Climate Week in September. To the panelists, thank you so much for the incredible work that you do and for spending some time with us today to share about it with this group. And then to the entire group, join us tomorrow at noon Eastern. We'll look at the food system's impact on the planet, as today was a focus on food systems impact on people. Thank you everyone for joining. And thanks to NYU and NYC for all your leadership. And I think with that, we're done. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day. Thanks again.